and welcome back to my studio. Today, I want to take you on a journey into bold brushwork and glowing light. The subject, Viktor from Arcane. Whether you're a fan of the show, just hungering for more Arcane content after the second season just ended, or you're an oil painter who is striving for expressive, luminous portraits, even if you've never heard the show, this video is for you, because by the end of this video, you're going to learn how to add incredible depth and a radiant glow to your paintings by combining thick brushwork with really carefully controlled color that's gonna perfectly convey that strong backlighting that you might be looking for in your pieces, especially your portraits. If getting the kind of brushwork or effects with light or looseness in your painting has really been tripping you up, don't worry, I'm here to help. If you want more guidance, make sure you stick around till the end of this video for a way to dive even deeper into this process and really address these sticking points once and for all. All right, let's dive into the painting. Before picking up my brush, I leaned into a tried and true strategy. This really set me up for success, and that was to create a mock-up for the abstract background or loose brushwork in this painting. So I know that we're going to talk about how to get really exciting impasto and how that ties into really bold brushwork, but part of the bold brushwork in this came from how I actually planned this piece and the areas where I intentionally told myself that it would be okay to let go and not follow the reference completely. In my previous video, I broke down my approach to planning this abstracted, loose painterly background. So I will link that above in case you want to check that out step by step, but here's a quick recap. So for Viktor's painting, I wanted the background to really pay homage to how beautiful the art in this show is. So I didn't want to perfectly render everything as if it had just been like a photograph. Instead, I wanted the brushwork to really play a leading role in this piece. And my goal there was to really strike a balance. I wanted the brushwork to feel dynamic enough to really pull the viewer in, but I didn't want to take away from the realism of the portrait in any way. So what I did was I went ahead and first I looked for inspiration around having a background that was made up just of these loose brush marks. This gave me a sense of what's possible, what looks good, what do I resonate with. And then I went ahead and I put down a preliminary test layer of some of those loose marks, and I actually brought them into Photoshop and I superimposed them behind Viktor's portrait to see, would my canvas, as it is with the background that I've painted, would this work? Or does it feel somehow out of balance, or does it, detract in some way or distract from the portrait itself? So in Viktor's case, I was really inspired by this dreamy, galaxy-like aesthetic that he's standing in front of. So I thought that having dark brushwork for this background would be ideal, and it would also really work for the glow that I wanted to capture with his hair. If I had chosen a light background here, it just wouldn't have worked. I think it might be helpful to note here that the color that I chose for this abstract brushwork was largely based on the value of the background and the original reference. I find that when in doubt, sticking with the value structure from your reference will typically help with the realism. Once I had this in Photoshop and I made a couple of small adjustments to that background, I knew I was ready to go into the portrait. And so this is where I'm actually going to talk about this glow effect that I created. So a lot of you might be interested in really capturing light in your paintings, or doing backlit portraits, or making paintings that really feature some kind of glowing light. And the magic of a glowing effect, the secret that I will go ahead and share with you right now for free on YouTube, is that it's not about the contrast or the brightness. It's about the transitions of color and all the different hues that your color mixtures actually pass through. So for instance, with Viktor's example, we have almost a pure white for the hair, but then this passes through what's essentially a cad yellow light and then a cad orange. There might be some places of cad red, but in his case, there's also moments of like viridian or permanent rose. The temptation that most people really succumb to when trying to create a glow effect in a painting is that, one, they try to just create the glow with essentially like white and black. They might do it with like yellow and black if we're using candlelight as an example. They might have a couple places where they have some red, but typically you're simply not passing through enough colors. Now, the other aspect to creating a convincing glow beyond the colors that you choose is that there needs to be a bloom of light. So in Viktor's case here, it's not just that we have the really beaming white hair against a dark background, and it's not enough to have those little intermediary colors that your color mixtures are going to pass through. You know, those bright cadmiums, those yellows, those oranges. There is also a very soft gradient of light color into dark color that spills out into the dark background. So in Viktor's case, what this looks like is this is where we start to have those areas of magenta or viridian that sort of blend from the edge of Viktor's face or hair into the darkness of the background. In order for me to capture this glow, I had to make sure that I was successfully capturing both of these elements. And by the way, anytime you are dealing with candlelight or something like a sunset, the kind of light where you can see the light source or your subject is backlit and you can really see this glow of light around your subject from a light source that might be just out of view, you really need both of these elements. There is going to be a whole lot of color, a whole lot of different hues you have to capture. And in addition, you need to make sure that there is that bloom of a gentle gradient of light. This one is typically a little bit more about value than about color. So essentially, you just want to avoid a really, really harsh transition between your whites and your darks. The darker areas next to the brightest areas need to be lightened a little bit. Now, I will be honest, creating this glow effect was not a flawless process for me. When I first started working on this glow, I really struggled with muddiness in some areas. And the reason is that I simply was a little bit rusty. I have been focusing on teaching and a lot of just the general running of the business that has come after winning the OPA gold medal, running a studio sale. So I have not been painting as much as I normally do. And I really felt it in this painting, especially considering the challenge that this subject presented with this beautiful, striking, glowing light. So the result is that I made a little bit of a mess, but the good news is I know a lot of you struggle with this same thing, and this painting is proof that making a mess doesn't actually have to trip you up. On top of that, every mistake teaches you something. In fact, it teaches you way more than just getting it right. And so what I had actually done, what happened in this painting, is I made the mistake of having my darks, having the light areas, and going in with a yellow pigment right against that black background color. The result is that the color that resulted when these two colors blended together was just not vibrant. And I realized that if I had truly set myself up for success, I would have slowly worked my way across those hues that I mentioned to help avoid a really muddy blending of paint. So for instance, since I put this black abstract brushwork down first for the background, what I would have gone ahead and done next is start to work some of the viridian mixture into that black, because I know that the viridian and black will play nicely together. It's not going to really kill the intensity or create a muddy effect. Then I would have gone ahead and lightened that viridian a little bit, because most of the viridian color we see is more of like a minty green. And then once I have a green to work into, I would have started to carefully introduce my areas of cad orange and cad yellow light or cad yellow pale. And then I would have worked the white of his hair into that. Now, here's the thing. If I had just been in a groove and I had set myself up for success right from the beginning, I wouldn't have realized that there's really a formula for how to essentially layer all these different hues such that it wouldn't make a mess. Additionally, I realized that some of these colors work really well when you have a little bit of transparency. And if I had been really thoughtful about what colors need to go down first to get that transparency, I could have had the effect I wanted much more easily, much more successfully. But here's the thing. I wouldn't have come away with that realization if I hadn't messed it up. And on top of that, and I think this is something where intermediate painters can get really tripped up. As soon as you make a mistake, it's really easy to think, oh, well, it's ruined. But the truth is, you can probably save it. And I found myself having this realization as I was painting. I realized, okay, well, the paint is all still wet. Like, I can wipe back to the white of the canvas if I really have to. And chances are, if I just kind of get curious and I experiment, I will probably find a way to fix these areas that just happen to get a little muddy. And that's exactly what happened. Similarly, I had some students this week asking me about the right kind of brush to get the impasto that I got in Viktor's hair and how to get thicker paint in there successfully in a way that creates an interesting texture. And what I wound up sharing with those students was that it's less about there being one perfect brush and more about trusting that you have the right brush in your arsenal. Just like with this idea of muddying up the colors, it's the same concept as trusting that you can fix this. Usually, if you are just patient and curious, you actually can arrive at a good solution. Now, this isn't to say that you simply need to work a painting to death and it will suddenly fix the issue with creating mud. No, of course, I had to be really thoughtful and intentional in this process, and my top priority really had to be making sure that I was avoiding making anything more muddy. I had to really prioritize keeping things clean and making my life easier, not harder. So if I'm talking about the glow, that meant that as I tried to clean up my color and correct some of the muddiness, every mark I put down had to move me toward the vibrancy that I was looking for. And similarly, as I was experimenting with my brushes to get the kind of impasto that I needed for the beaming white of his hair, I needed to ensure that I wasn't building up paint that was way too thick with the wrong texture. And instead, as soon as I realized that a brush just wasn't cutting it, I would go ahead and I would select a clean brush that I thought would help me to better make the mark I was trying to achieve. So now that we've covered that, let me go ahead and talk a little bit about the process for achieving this impasto. This was actually really helpful in correcting some of the muddiness, actually, because I needed the white to be so bright and so perfect that if it happened to get dulled down at all in this process, it would be really apparent. What I actually had to do here was to build up the impasto with the white so that I could keep the white really clean. So here are the things that actually set me up for success with that. The first, and this might seem to be the most obvious, but you have to load your brush generously. And that typically starts with being generous on the palette. So no stingy little tiny daubs of paint. You need a nice pile of paint for this on the palette, and then you can't be afraid to really load that paint up onto the brush. Impasto comes from a lot of paint. There's just no way around it. Next, you need to layer strategically. Here's what I mean by that. I didn't just go around throwing impasto anywhere. Specifically, I knew that I wanted the impasto to be in the hair. I wanted it to convey that hair texture. So I didn't go around building this impasto up in the areas of his face. Similarly, impasto tends to make the most sense in the lighter areas of the painting. because the areas receiving light tend to be the areas we perceive as being most dimensional. Now, that's an oversimplification. I am not a physicist, so I'm not going to get into a big lecture on how exactly color and light work. But that's essentially the simple version. If you need a rule of thumb, it is that impasto and opacity, it tends to make the most sense in the light areas of a painting. Areas that make sense to be more transparent and thinner tend to be the dark areas. So I went ahead and made sure that I was prioritizing that impasto in the hair, and I wanted my marks to look hair-like, especially considering the sort of ethereal otherworldliness of this painting. I really needed to make sure that this light area looked like hair, that hair was the thing being captured here. And that leads me to the third thing, which is that I had to experiment with my tools to help find a brush that helped me to really deposit the impasto in a way that looked hair-like and also was pretty thick. So at first in this painting, I was primarily using things like ivories or evergreens, basically synthetic bristle alternatives that had a very crisp, clean shape, and the shape happened to be a filbert. I find that that's great for painting like the skin of the face, but it doesn't really create hair-like texture. I need a brush that has a little bit more of a natural texture to it that is going to help me to really do that job. And the result is that I picked up a brush that I haven't used in a long time, which is an Eclipse extra long comber. What I love about these combers is that they are so like flimsy and floppy in terms of the stiffness of the bristle. And the bristle is also a little bit more natural in terms of its shape and its edge, that naturally it really does a good job of weirdly holding a lot of paint, but then allowing that paint to very gently glide off of the brush. So you'll notice as I work on the hair in this piece, I'm putting quite a lot of paint onto this flimsy little comber, and I'm using a very light hand. This is the final key to getting that impasto. You have to have enough paint, and I think one other point that I would make here is that the consistency can't be too stiff. I'm using Vasari here, and Vasari tends to have a creamier texture, so I didn't really need to change the texture of this by adding medium or solvent. But having enough paint of the right consistency on the brush is really the first ingredient that's important. Then the next key ingredient is that you essentially just let the paint glide off the brush by using a very light hand, and probably by laying the brush kind of horizontally onto your canvas versus holding it like straight up and down, like the brush is perpendicular to that canvas. All right, and here is the finished painting. A blend of abstraction, of thick textures, of that brilliant glow around Viktor's hair. Together, these elements really create depth in the work, and just as importantly, they capture the kind of composition and design that I'm drawn to. So now it's your turn. If this approach excites you, and if it helps you to solve problems that you run into with your brushwork or capturing, the brilliant light that you love in your pieces, I want you to try out these tips and techniques. And if you want to explore planning out your pieces at this high level like I've shown here, I want you to check out my masterclass. It's packed with insights tailored for painters just like you. I'll include a link down in the description. It would be a perfect next step now that you have watched this video. Thanks so much for spending time with me in my studio today. Until next time, I hope you're enjoying watching and rewatching season 2 of Arcane like I am. And until then, happy painting.